Taiwan is bursting with heaps of fun places to explore. Join me, Amber Hatfield, as I hit up travel hotspots, soak up some culture, and hunt down hidden gems. Let's go! Welcome back to Let's Go. On today's show, we are going to be looking into the island of Kinmen, one of the outlying islands of Taiwan. I'm joined by my guest Ferdinand, who is from Germany and lives in Kinmen. He's got lots to tell us about the history of the island and more. So Ferdinand, I'll let you introduce yourself.
Thanks for having me. So, story is pretty simple. I'm a German citizen and I lived most of my life in Munich. But a few years ago, I met my wife in Taipei. And as these things go, we got together. We spent 2 years in Germany together. And then we decided to move to Taiwan. So I think that is a bit a special flavor to the story. My wife works in Kinmen. And so I moved to Kinmen Island, very close to the Chinese border.
And how long have you been living in Kinmen?
I'm now in Taiwan for a bit more than a year. I'm still mainly in Kinmen, but due to work, I am also spent more and more time in Taipei.
Let's start with talking about a bit of background to Kinmen Island itself.
Sure. The first thing is Kinmen is the most Chinese place in Taiwan. It is directly in front of the city of Xiamen in the Fujian province. It was the last battleground of the Chinese Civil War in 1949, and the KMT managed to keep it. So it is right in front of the border of China, but it is part of Taiwan. And it has a few more special features when it comes to history that make this island very unique. And it's also today a very famous tourist destination. Another alternative name, is Kinmen, which is Hokkien, meaning exactly the same thing. The university, for instance, is Kinmen Daxue.
Oh, yeah. Okay. I wasn't sure about what Kinmen actually meant. So that's just the Hokkien word for Kinmen.
Yeah.
Right, okay. And Kinmen is not just one island, is that right? It's made up of many islands, is that correct?
Yes, the two most important ones is there's Da Kinmen and Xiao Kinmen, so big and small Kinmen. There is a few others. There's the Dardan Island that you can visit only as a cruise, a cruise ship. There's a few other islands that are either uninhabited or there is one island, but that is a pure military base. The military plays a very important role. I tried to come up with some important benchmarks, but actually I want to start with the fact that it's not so much about China and not so much about Taiwan. It is the fact that Kinmen was not part of the Japanese colony. So Taiwan came under Japanese rule, and I think that was quite important for the independence and for the development of Taiwan. Kinmen, until the Second World War, was always part of the Chinese Empire. It was briefly occupied by Japan during the Second World War, and then it became part of Taiwan, or became part of China until 1949. And then the KMT had to flee China. They lost the civil war, but they managed to keep Kinmen. Kinmen then was a military zone. Until 1995, there were no civilians allowed.
Oh.
So the martial law actually was going on longer than in mainland Taiwan. And then it became the tourist island that is today. That military occupation time, there were a few Taiwanese trade crises. The third one wasn't too much about Kinmen, but the first and the second Taiwanese trade crisis, Kinmen was in the very center of it.
How would you say that the history of Kinmen, how does that relate to the situation in Taiwan now and how Kinmen is now?
So people always lived there, but it was always soldiers, military personnel and their family. So there were at the peak more than 150,000 soldiers on Kinmen Island. It was heavily bombarded until 1979. There was always sort of short scenes of aggression and long time tension. Kinmen actually was a a major topic in the American-US election. When Nixon ran against Kennedy, it became hot in US politics. There have been some really hot phases, right? It was heavily bombarded. There was many landmines. There's a landmine museum documenting that history. However, today it's peaceful. Today it's mine-free. And I think a very good way to sum it up, we mentioned the name of Quemoy, and the Hokkien or Mina name of Xiamen and Xiamen is Amoy. If you go to Singapore, there is a years before, 20 years ago, many people migrated from the Fujian province. You find a Amoy street in Singapore, where people moved there. And you also find a Quemoy house over there that is built by those settlers. So the point is that actually Xiamen and Kinmen, they share history, and there's strong business ties, there's strong family ties. And those 30, 40 years of military hot stage from the Chinese Civil War till the peak was in 1979 is a real extreme situation, but it sounds more drastic than it actually is. That's actually why I started doing my videos, because it's very easy to frame Kinmen as a military fort or so, which it is not, right? It's a very peaceful island, it's a beautiful island, and it has its very own history that is a bit more complicated. You have to drill into it, but I can tell you, once you start that, you get really excited, because it has so many levels, and it's, for me, I'm a bit of a history nerd, I confess, it is super interesting.
If people are on Kinmen or thinking about visiting Kinmen, what kind of places can people go to learn about this history?
So I think around a third of Kinmen Island is protection area managed by the Kinmen National Park. All the coastlines are protected. And then there's also these older forts. Like I said, there is still military personnel, I think like 10,000 people. And of course, there is tension between China and Taiwan, but in day-to-day life we don't really feel it. However, during the hot stage of the conflict, you have all these military fortifications, you have old tanks, and that is all museums. You can go into them, most of them, and they kept in shape. So a lot of people go there to see it. Some soldiers go there, right? I mean, many people who've been there in the 60s and 70s with their military service, they want to see it again. But also many Chinese people come. Chinese are actually the biggest tourists. And it's pretty cool. I mean, there is a few underground tunnels. There's a landmine museum. There is loads of tanks. There is place where you interact. There is live shows. So it's a lot of things for the military geeks. There is the August 23rd museum. August 23rd was remembering the shelling of the island, that you get an idea how heavy the shelling was. There is the Landmine Museum in Xiaojinmen that also gives you an idea how heavily mined it was. And there's more military stuff. But then not only do military stuff. Check out the old villages from the Ming and Qing dynasty. I mean, there is history before 1949, right? That gives you an idea what actually happened to Kinmen, why Kinmen and Xiamen are so intermingled, and also why so many people left the island. There is something called Western-style buildings. Those are built by those people that went to Singapore, to Malaysia. So people from Kinmen went abroad because there was a certain poverty. And then they went to countries that had been colonized. And over there they got inspiration. Some actually made a career and were able to send money back. And they built these Western-style buildings, so it's very big mansions. Sometimes they look more like Indonesian or Malaysian-style buildings, but some actually look like Dutch colony buildings. Very beautiful ones. Today they are also museums, and today they are also free. Some are falling apart, actually. There's another issue I'm going to talk about in a second. But see the Western-style buildings. Yeah, that is, I think, one thing for sure that is very amazing. We get a feeling for the history. And also it sort of balances the whole why Kinmen is not just conflict, right? You see actually that this is a fairly peaceful place. The thing is, some of these days, hundreds of those Western-style buildings, some are falling apart because the Taiwanese government cannot find the people who inherited those.
I see.
So they try to look it up. They cannot just size the buildings. But yeah, those families then maybe their children, or they stayed in Malaysia, they stayed in Singapore, or wherever, somehow in the Philippines as well, and continue living, of course. Just the house was built and falling apart. And then the Taiwanese government tried to find, okay, who is owning this? Do we have the right to just take it, or what we're going to do? And there they can't locate them. It's so you see actually many sort of buildings falling apart. It's crazy. It's like buildings that 300 years old.
Yeah.
And they look once really beautiful. Some are used as movie scenes, actually.
Okay.
Movies produced, yeah.
Are there any other interesting places that you'd suggest people go to check out to learn about Jinmen history?
The other thing is there is some very different museums. There's a prostitution museum, which I think is actually quite important. So what happened, again, for the soldiers, the Taiwanese government at the time said, yeah, we want to do something against illegal prostitution, and the way to do this is legal prostitution. So there were military brothels, and one of them is now also a museum, right? And then in these museums, there's many different kinds of museums, so to say, what happened. And I think it gives you an idea about the history of the island and what actually happened, and why I am maybe so emotional, so interested in the island, because it has a certain depth. It often gets portrayed the wrong way, I would say, either as military stronghold or as, I don't know, like patriotic place. In day-to-day politics, Kinmen is so different, right? It has the highest birth rate in Taiwan because education is very cheap. It has there's so many stories that sort of I found every day, and they actually find their way into the Western media as well, but they have a completely different tone in the Western media. So I would say, I think you just have to come and see Kinmen to get the sense of it.
It was such an interesting discussion today with Ferdinand about Jinmen's history and all of the military and non-military aspects to that, which may not always be talked about. Ferdinand has his own YouTube channel where he makes videos about Jinmen. He has a really interesting series called the Jinmen Travel Tales that you can check out with loads of information about Jinmen, its history and more. So please go and check that out at the Traveling Kunz, Kunz, on YouTube. I hope you enjoyed today's episode, and next week Ferdinand will be back and we'll be chatting more about Jinmen and some of the other spots to go and visit when you're there. See you next time.